Oh, I'm looking for my chat window. I'm going to give you guys some time to come in tonight. You get the modern me. I hope you're not disappointed. Oh, I'm having trouble finding my chat. Hold on, let me find my chat window. I'm so sorry, those of you who are there, if you're sending me a message, I can't see it right now, but let me just start this up. Okay, so hello from the modern Mrs. Q of Hanover Square. There, now I'm seeing your messages. Fantastic. And I see we have some people on Zoom. I hope you can see, you can hear me okay. If you can't hear me, send me a message. And tonight you get the real me, the real 20th century me. I've been working so hard on this dress that I just, did not want to get dressed tonight. Also, just to let you know, all of my foundational garments are under this dress on the sewing dummy. So every time I fit something on the dress, I have to take everything off the dummy, put it all on me, make sure it looks good, put everything back on the dummy, make the next correction or adjustment, and I just didn't want to change again. So tonight you get the 21st century Mrs. Q and a look at the beautiful dress I will be wearing next Saturday for our inauguration tour. I also have this hold on a second, I just want to open this window up. I also have this beautiful trim that just arrived that I will be putting around the sleeve. Let me find the edge of the trim so you can see it. It's quite beautiful. And this is going to go around the sleeves. This will go around the sleeves if you can see it okay. Let me try the other arm. Maybe that'll look a little better. You can see it around the arm. So that will go around the sleeves. And I think since we're going to be doing French, 2 rows on the sleeve and also a couple tiers around the lower part of the skirt. And so behind me, what you're seeing is the top, which is the jacket. And this is a Thai silk, which was a gift from an old friend of mine. And the dress is some white Dupioni silk, which I recently bought. And they look really nice together with my new stays. And I also made, if you were following me on social media, I made a new false rump or butt cushion, which is on the dummy. And that's why the sides of this flare up so nicely, if I can get my finger in the right place. You can see right here, you can see it flares up really nicely in the corners. That's because that nice big false rump is on there. So it's looking really nice, comes down in a nice V and puffs up. It should look quite beautiful. So I hope you'll all be joining us next Saturday. If you're in New York City, you can come live and in person. I'm going to put the link here for tickets right now. PatriotToursNYC.com. If you're not in New York City, join us on the live stream. We'll be live streaming the full event. And whether you buy a live stream ticket or an in-person ticket, the live stream will also be available in the future for you to watch anytime and to share with anyone you think would like to learn all about the inauguration and the United States Constitution with James Madison. I'll be out, of course, with James Madison, and my sister, Mrs. Van R, will be joining us too. We'll be talking about how we got the Constitution, what it means, And I do have some updates on the tour route. St. Paul's Chapel has reopened, so we will be able to visit St. Paul's, the site of the president's inaugural service. And we'll be talking about the incredible pastor who presided over that service and his really inspiring life story. Of course, we'll be heading down to Thomas Jefferson's home, talking about Jefferson a little bit, over to Federal Hall, where we'll talk about the inauguration itself, and we'll be ending at Fraunces Tavern Museum. And for those of you joining live, we will be going in to the long room where General Washington gave his farewell address at the end of the Revolutionary War, of course, putting into effect the steps that would lead us to the United States Constitution and self-government. On the live stream, I apologize, but we don't have permission to live stream in the museum. So we'll be ending the live stream in front of the museum with a little bit of a talk about it. So I hope you'll all be joining us. Tickets are available at patriottoursnyc.com, and I hope to see you live and in person or on the live stream. So now to get to tonight's topic, which I said would be the anniversary that just passed of Lexington and Concord and the ridiculous and corrupt actions of the Parliament that led to that historic and world-changing event. And I'm just going to take a quick second here to look at your comments. Great, you all like the dress. I like the dress too, and it's going to look really superb on, I hope. We'll see, it's looking good so far. Mr. Q has been commenting along the way. He says it looks good too. So Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. And I did mention on social media that one of the things that occurs on my tours quite often is that people don't realize the war began before the Declaration of Independence of July 4th, 1776, that people don't realize the Declaration was a result of the beginning of the invasion on the part of the British, which occurred more than a year before, beginning with April 19th, 1775. And I think a reason for that is the way we learn history. You probably learned history the way I did, as a really boring timeline of events, one occurring right after the other, which makes it very uninteresting and also doesn't represent the way history really occurs. We find that history truly is a web of all types of events, and any pull on any event on that web affects all of the other events in that web. So in order to understand Lexington and Concord, we really need to understand what was going on in some other places besides America. Namely England, India, and China, as well as America. Oh, thank you, Mrs. McCabe. I'm glad you like the dress. I'm sure you'll enjoy seeing me wearing it on April 30th. Hopefully it won't be too windy that day. The silk is really light. It flies around pretty easily. I'm going to starch it though, so it should stay in place. So as I said, sort of a web of events. So I think that when we learn American history in school, we kind of learn it in a really boring manner. And we learn kind of that events follow each other on a line, that this event leads to this event, leads to this event. It doesn't really happen that way. There's like a whole bunch of events here, and they all kind of affect each other. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit of that tonight so that you'll have a better idea of the events that led to Lexington and Concord, or the shot heard around the world, and then the events that led from that to the Declaration of Independence. And maybe you'll get a better idea in your head of what's going on in the world at that time and all the different things that are happening to make this happen. I'm not sure what I'm hearing. I hope you're not hearing it too. Sounds like Mr. Q is watching something somewhere. It is. It's Mr. Q. I hope you're not hearing his video. If you are, let me know and I will tell him to turn it down. So Lexington and Concord, we all know the shot heard around the world, right? That was the day that General Thomas Gage led the British soldiers from Boston out through Lexington in an attempt to confiscate the powder and the weapons of the people of Massachusetts. The occupation of Massachusetts by British soldiers had been going on for quite some time, right, as a result of the Quartering Act. And feelings had become quite, what I'm going to say, hostile on both sides. so that the people of Boston started putting away powder and weapons in the event of an invasion from Britain. Right? You remember the Boston Tea Party caused them to be occupied a year before Lexington and Concord, and that occupation was becoming more and more brutal, and the people were becoming angrier and angrier. So they were putting away powder and weapons to store them for self-defense. And in Parliament, they're becoming very insecure about this whole idea, and General Gage receives orders to go confiscate the powder and those weapons. And at first, General Gage really does not want to do this. I don't know if you're aware, but General Gage had been in command for about 12 years at that time, most of that time spent in the city of New York. General Gage was very savvy about the colonies and understood the colonists quite well. He also had a decent understanding of the failures of the royal governors, which had led to some of the growing hostilities in the colonies as well. So he's a very smart man. And he writes back that he really doesn't want to do this. He says, he doesn't want to do it for a few reasons. First of all, he says they're British subjects and they have the right of self-defense. So this doesn't sit well with me. He said, second of all, every person over the age of 12 in this country has a firearm and is skilled in the use of it. And I fear that if we try to do this with the number of men I have, that they'll line the roads and they'll shoot us as we pass. And I really do not want to do this. And we should find a better accommodation. We should, be open to hearing their grievances and look for some better solution. And the response from England pretty much is, do it, or we'll be happy to commission someone in your place who will take the order. So General Gage reluctantly takes that order. Now, as you know, the people of Boston and the surrounding areas are preparing for a British invasion. They know it's coming at some time or another, so they're somewhat ready for this to happen. And when it does, they are prepared to meet them. So what did I see? Oh, the other day I was watching the YouTube video of this year's reenactment at Lexington Green. If you haven't seen it, you just go to YouTube, reenactment Lexington Green 2022, and they have a wonderful video there showing this year's reenactment, very nicely done. And the people of Lexington, of course, are regular people. They're artisans, they're farmers, they're not soldiers. They come out on the green, the men do, with whatever weapons they have, and they stand there peacefully. The idea being that if they stand there peacefully and they don't shoot, the British officers will never give the British forces order to shoot unless they're shot at first, and that they'll show their displeasure and their rebellion, and the British will simply pass right by, which should have been what happened, but you know the story. Some unknown person fired a shot, shots were exchanged, and men, British subjects, innocent British subjects, were killed on Lexington Green. And this was a big problem for General Gage, a massive embarrassment, as it was known that the British troops were never to be deployed against subjects of the crown unless, in case of, an armed rebellion, which Lexington certainly was not, as they were standing there peacefully with their weapons down. So this is a big problem for General Gage, and they continue marching out to Concord. By the time they get to Concord, word has spread to Concord that this has happened, and the militias, or we call them the Minutemen, come out. They shoot the British as they pass, as General Gage predicted would happen, and drive them back to Boston. And this is a great tragedy. As the great former Prime Minister William Pitt, 1st Earl of Chatham, warned the Parliament, we should remove the army from Boston, because I tell you, the first shot will be mortal. There will be no going back, and we will lose the colonies. We cannot beat them. And so that is pretty much what happened, that first shot was heard around the world because it was mortal. There was no going back from those shots on Lexington Green. So how did we get to a situation on Lexington Green where this happened, where British troops did shoot upon subjects of the crown, peaceful subjects of the crown? Well, in my opinion, of course, I'm an American, or if I'm speaking as Mrs. Q in the 18th century, she is a Whig or a rebel who's opposed to the excesses of British rule. And so we would say that it was a result of failures on the part of the British Parliament, a system of failures, not only in governing the colonies, but in governing the affairs of the East India Trading Company. So we all know about that, right? The tea, and we were forced to buy the East India tea in order to bail them out and 21st century language, because the East India Company was going bankrupt. They had been involved in what we might today call a Ponzi scheme in their Asian trade. So the East India Company primarily bought things from China, and the Chinese were very restrictive in the way they would allow the East India Company to trade with them. They could only trade in one harbor, and they could only trade with very specific agents of China, and they had to pay in gold. Where would England get all of that gold? Well, the East India Company had a great idea about that. We'll get it from India. We'll write a bunch of IOUs to India, and we'll say, okay, we'll pay you back in British pounds if you'll loan us this gold. So they took the gold from India and paid China. And eventually the IOUs came due. Of course, they had no money or gold because their sales in America were not that good. They had no money or gold, and they could not pay back India, which meant the company would be in serious financial trouble, which meant all of the investors in London heavily invested in East India stock, and derivatives of that stock would lose their investments. And that included a huge real estate boom that had gone on in London as a result of the East India Company. This might all sound a little familiar to you. Speaking as my 21st century person now, I can say this ought to sound very familiar to you because it has happened many times since, right? So now we have a company who's financially failing, their stock is falling, everyone's invested in the stock, and then people are invested in the companies invested in the stock, and they're also invested in derivative financial instruments based on the stock. And so we have a panic that occurs in London, and we must find a way to aid the East India Company. And thus comes the Tea Act, which withdrew the customs on the British tea as it was sold in America to make it cheaper than the other tea in the hopes we would buy it and that money coming in would help aid the East India Company. And of course, the people of the colonies were too smart to fall for it and refuse to buy the tea. And in Boston, they were the first to throw the tea into the harbor, not only to refuse to buy it, but to destroy the tea. So this is a series of bad ideas, primarily because the Parliament never understood the colonies, never took the time to thoroughly understand the colonies. And those members of Parliament who had visited here spoke out in the Parliament and said exactly that you must go there and see the colonies because they are not what you think. And gentlemen here in America said the same thing, that the Parliament was a distant and corrupt government that knew nothing of our way of life here. All of this being true, the Parliament really looked at the people of the colonies as, refuse, as peasants and lowlifes and criminals and people who could never achieve anything as great as the aristocrats of England. But people who'd visited here, like Adam Smith, William Pitt, some other gentlemen, looked around and saw what had been built in the colonies and went back and said, you do not understand what they have built there. You must go see it. And of course, they laughed at him. He had the gout. He was getting a little old. The idea was that, oh, Pitt is out of his mind. Nothing could be as great as what we have built in England. But what had they built in England? An aristocracy based on the exploitation not only of a permanent peasantry, but exploitation of colonies everywhere, including these American colonies, from which they took cheap raw materials, manufactured goods, and sold them back at a premium price, forbidding us from manufacturing those goods to compete with them. And if we bought those goods from another country, requiring us to buy them from British ships, which then had tariffs imposed that made them more expensive than the British versions. See how this is all working, right? So England is what it is through exploitation of its American colonies, exploitation of a peasant class, cheap servants and employees, and a landed aristocracy, which kept all of the money and wealth among itself. If you were a peasant in England, you couldn't open a business and get a loan and expand your business. Which is exactly what they were attempting to make happen here. But since there were so many of us here and we had to fend for ourselves, that system never was fully enacted. And in the colonies, we had people all farming, building things, making things, and creating an economy of its own. England did not understand the creation of this new economy in the colonies and how powerful it was. If they did, they would have followed Mr. Pitt's advice, dropped the navigation acts, made us a part of British Empire trade, brought us under their wing, and allow our goods to travel around the world on British ships. But maybe, in the back of their mind somewhere, they sensed that competition with us, they would be overwhelmed by that competition. And Pitt explained to them also that that would happen. He said, an island can't rule a continent. The colonies will have the world. They are the greatest economic force we have ever seen, and they will have the world. And they will either have it as a part of the British Empire, or they will rule the world and us through it. Very wise words from Mr. Pitt, which were laughed at by most of the people in England, but very true, as you know, looking back, this is what happened. So we see Lexington and Concord as being the result of all of these failures of England to understand us, the failure to understand that we were building our own economy, that we would not abide by the stamp tax, that we would not abide by the Quartering Act, that we would not accept the old rotting East India tea, that we saw through all of these attempts to control us and suppress us and exploit us for the aristocrats' wealth and power, to exploit us for themselves, that we would eventually see through this, and that we would see the corruption in the parliament, that we would see that many members of parliament were there because of donations on the part of financial companies and corporations in London. And that, of course, then when it came time for them to decide anything, they would decide in favor of those corporations, which maybe in England was okay because people were accustomed to an aristocracy that exploited them, but to us in the colonies was not okay because we saw through that. And we didn't want to be exploited by those companies in London or those financial institutions for the benefit of an aristocracy that did nothing for us. And they had this constant failure of understanding of who we were. Even when General Gage says they believe in their right of self-defense, they're all armed. They're going to line the roads and shoot us as we pass. I just realized my green screen doesn't go all the way over, and you probably just saw Mr. Q go by. Well, that's what I get for wanting to do a modern show tonight, or a half and half show. There's this hand pulling the green screen. Yes, moving the green screen for you. So even General Gage understands what's happening here and tries to warn his counterparts, and they won't listen to him. So we see Lexington and Concord as all of these failures to even try to understand who we are in the colonies. And of course, the big thing that's going on in London at the time, all of the corruption and the attempt to salvage the East India Company, which has got itself into such a financial hole that it's threatening to bring down the entire London economy with it. So that are some of the events leading to Lexington and Concord. Of course, we could talk also about the French Indian War, where we were told that the English fought the French and the savages, as they said, on our behalf. But really, that was a war between the French and the English for territory, involving the Mohicans on the English side and the Huron on the French side. It had nothing to do with us. So England then says, oh, we fought this big war on your behalf, you need to help pay for it, and now we have to quarter troops there in order to protect you, and you need to pay for those as well. And that was the beginning of us starting to see through the lies that were coming from England, and England continuing to believe they could just tell us anything and we would basically believe it, because over here, of course, we're uneducated, and if we are educated, it's not up to their standards, of course, which would make it very hard to believe why our wonderful lawyers of New York, specifically Mr. William Livingston and his two law partners, continually beat the British lawyers in court, arguing their own common law. So, of course, we were not dumb over here or uneducated. And since we built an economy here, people understood it. People understood it because it was their life. People needed to make money to survive here. There was no other way to survive except to work and earn a living. So people understood it very well. And whenever any of those earnings were being taken in taxes, people wanted to know what those taxes specifically were going to, and that they were being used in our benefit, since it was the money we ourselves had made. So we see all of these misunderstandings on the part of a distant and corrupt government of people who did not live anything like the way we, I was going to say live now, lived then. My modern person would say that we may be in a bit of that type of crisis as well today, as all governments become distant from the people they govern, and become wealthy and begin to act in their own interest and no longer in the interest of the people they govern, whose lives they no longer understand at all. And this is not something I say as a great 21st century radical, but as a student of history, and that all governments become this. And people then change that government, and the government becomes responsive to the people, and over time it becomes non-responsive to the people, and the people turn against it. And this is a cycle that has been going on as long as governments have existed. And of course, some of you who are knowledgeable about history already know this, that this is nothing new today or even then. So those misunderstandings, or those willful misunderstandings and corruptions in London, led to the shot heard round the world, which indeed changed London for all time. Because after that shot, it was only a matter of time until England lost her American colonies. And the intelligent men and women of England knew that. A number of Whig aristocrats knew that shot meant the colonies were lost to them, and that it would be a long and protracted war that they would indeed lose. And so you know the rest of the story, right? They lost the war. General Washington went home, refusing to make himself a king, which was his right at that time, right? When you were a king and when you were a general, you defeated another king, you were now king. General Washington went home and laid the groundwork for what was to come, our great United States Constitution. And just another thing about the Constitution, I think Mr. Q wants something. Do you need something? Another thing about the Constitution that people on my tour don't know, which I think is rather shocking, is that our great founders who wrote that document gave us a way to change our government peacefully, as they had already experienced a non-responsive government and a rebellion, a war. They wanted to make sure we would not go through that, and they gave us some wonderful things, right? Every 2 years, we can replace our entire House of Representatives. Every single one, every 2 years, has to stand for re-election. We can change our House every 2 years. Our Senate every 6 years. Every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate can be changed. So every 2 years, we can change the House and 1/3 of the Senate, so that every 6 years, the entire Senate can be changed. And we change our president every 4 years. So we have the gift of being able to remove people in office who are not responsive, or who are corrupt, or exploitative, or abusive of their positions over us. We've been given the gift to be able to remove them ourselves as an insurance against violent uprising against the government, so that we would never have something like, say, the French Revolution, or we would never have something like the American Revolution, although they knew that if it would come, that since the government would be here and be ours and be those among us, that if it ever became that exploitative and corrupt, we would more likely have something like the French Revolution. Our American Revolution was different because the government was not here among us, right? We were fighting the military in their place. But had we ever undergone the type of abuse that the people of France had by the French aristocracy, our revolution certainly would have been violent as well. Or if we are to experience that in the future, was their fear, the founders' fear, that our revolution would be more like the French Revolution. And so they gave us that great gift that we can willingly change our government regularly, in order to not let that happen. And I think they would be very surprised at the fact that we don't take advantage of that opportunity. But as I said, many people who come on my tour don't realize that. So that, again, is a flaw in our education, understanding our government and how it works. I think what we used to call civics, where we learned about the government. Yes, Mr. Linden, the East India Company was too big to fail. Absolutely, it was too big to fail. And someone even pretty much said that in the language of the time in a broadside here in New York City, called it too big to fail. Oh, Mr. Marr, thank you for your compliments. These are some compliments I'm getting on Facebook. Nice rendition of the facts concerning the very start of independence from the British, Mrs. Q. Thank you so much. I think it is so important for us to understand the events that led us to Lexington and Concord and the Revolutionary War. The way after that, our founders sought to ensure we would not experience that again by giving us the right to create our own government, to remake it every few years in order to make sure it remains responsive. And, my own concerns that we don't seem to be doing this anymore in America. And maybe we should start doing that, taking more active interest in replacing people who may have been in the government a little bit too long. Of course, we are going to talk about all of this on our April 30th tour. That is the subject of the tour, is how we got the United States Constitution, what kind of government does it make, and I will be taking the contrary view or the anti-federalist view, and Mr. Madison, of course, will be defending the Constitution, as he wrote most of it. He will be defending it, and we might have some interesting conversation in there because, Mr. Madison was from Virginia, and many of the Virginians were anti-federalists. So we'll be talking about that and how he parted ways with them in order to get the Constitution ratified. We'll be talking about the battle for ratification and the different sides and the ideas and the impediments to ratification. We'll be talking about the Bill of Rights and where it came from and why it's there, what it does. We'll be talking about, of course, how all of that creates a presidency and a first inauguration. We'll talk about the inauguration and the importance of that first inauguration and that first church service, first inaugural service. And we'll actually be ending the tour with the story of how it all started, George Washington's farewell at the end of the Revolutionary War, and the way that laid the groundwork for what was to come. We will also be talking about, if you don't know this already, how the Declaration of Independence was a promise and the Constitution a fulfillment of that promise. So lots of great stuff coming on April 30th with Kyle Jenks as Congressman Madison and me as Mrs. Q and Mrs. Van R. Of course, I'll be filling in the social stories with my sister as well on that tour. So I really do hope you'll come in person. The group is not that big, so we'll have a nice intimate group, or join us on the live stream. We will be taking your questions in the chat on the live stream. And even if you can't come, by the live stream and watch it in the future. And you can always email me your questions later. I'll be happy, or put them in the comments on YouTube, and I'll be happy to, answer them later, as will Mr. Madison. So we call it a Revolutionary War. Do the current British people refer to that war also as a revolution or a civil war? I think the people of England refer to it as that unpleasantness with the colonies and don't really refer to it much more, except the unpleasantness. I'll tell you a little bit of a distinction. That question was from Roxanne Wallace on YouTube. What do the British call it? It could not be a civil war. If it was a civil war, we would not be able to seek and receive the support of any European country. The royal families of England and Europe, although they battled often with each other, had some agreements between them, and one of them was to never get involved in the internal matters of each other's countries, thus civil wars. So if it was a civil war, we would not be able to get the support of France, Spain, Holland, and some other nations. It had to be us fighting as a separate nation against England. So we declared ourselves a separate nation. That's what part of what the Declaration of Independence does as a legal document, makes us a separate nation fighting the British Empire so that we can seek help from England's enemies. So the Declaration of Independence does a lot of things. And we won't talk about all of those on the tour, but we'll talk about some of them. And that's one of the things it does, establishes us as an enemy nation to England so that we can get support from her enemies. You're the enemy of my enemy is your friend, right? Ms. Wallace, you're welcome. Here we go. From Mrs. McCabe. I worked with the late Paula Felder, a lay historian. She preferred to refer to the Revolutionary War as the War for Independence. Yes. Do you have any comments on her preference? I prefer that as well, the War for Independence. And that is what it was. It was a war for independence, separation from England, establishing ourselves as a separate entity, looking for support in our independence. Mrs. McKay, that's a wonderful way to put it. And she is, of course, she was, of course, a brilliant lady, as you are as well. And I'm looking forward to your next trip to New York, whenever that may be. I have not seen you and Mr. McCabe in quite a while, and it would be very nice to see you in person. It would be nice to see all of you in person. If you're coming to New York, please take a tour with me. We have a great time when we go out. So that is all I have for you tonight. Next week is one of those special Mrs. Q's that's going to take place in the morning, because next Friday is my monthly talk for the Queens Public Library. It'll be at 10 a.m. I'll share the link with you, and the subject will be, well, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. I'll be talking about both of the gentlemen next Friday morning. So there will be no Mrs. Q live Friday night, but there will be our wonderful tour on Saturday. And I'm hoping to see a whole lot of you there, joining us to celebrate our great Constitution and our first president's inauguration. So thank you for joining me tonight. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Friday morning at the Queens Public Library. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week until I see you again.